Well, good evening. I'm sorry for the disorganized, disheveled appearance. And if it looks like I'm sweaty, or if I get sweaty throughout the course of this video, it's because I am sweaty. It's 41 degrees here. It's a good start. But I'm in a rush to get this video out because it's on my mind, and it's been on my mind for a very long time. You see, when I started this channel, when I started Bad Country, I started it with the intention of talking about my experiences with Delirium Tremens. And I talked about my experiences with DTs like 5 or 6 times, and then I was like, I'm done with that. And let's talk about sobriety, let's talk about recovery, let's talk about interesting facets of alcoholism that nobody else is talking about. And I never really returned to Delirium Tremens, even though I always felt like I had never finished talking about it. So I'm going to return to the subject, and my intention is to provide a kind of definitive account of my experience with Delirium Tremens, all 4 of them. So let's begin. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bad Country. I'm not going to try to explain the neuroscience behind Delirium Tremens. This isn't the Huberman podcast, and I don't know what I'm talking about. In fact, nobody fully understands it as far as I'm aware. It's a little bit like dreams. We know they exist, but the exact mechanisms behind them, the exact neurobiology and the exact chemistry is a mystery. In fact, even the purpose of them is not certain. And that's true of Delirium Tremens too. So I'm not going to try to explain the science, because I don't know it. And not only do I not know it, it is not known. It's not quite understood exactly what it is that causes. Look, the mechanisms that cause it are understood, right? I'm not going to bore you with what they are. What we don't understand is why. Why, for example, does withdrawal from alcohol cause such vivid and terrifying hallucinations? Kind of regardless of not knowing exactly what the science is, we do know that Delirium Tremens has the power to kill you. It is very legitimately, very really, with no exaggeration and no hyperbole, a medical emergency. One that is often fatal. And you don't need to know the exact biological reasons why if someone stabs you, you might die. You just know that you're going to die. And that's the approach we're going to take to Delirium Tremens today, is we're going to just acknowledge that it exists, that it is incredibly dangerous, and then we'll just talk about what it's like. And one final disclaimer, if you've been following Bad Country for a while, you will have heard some of this stuff before. I just want to collect it all in one place. So if I repeat myself or I tell a story that you've already heard, I'm sorry for that. You're under no obligation to continue watching. Please feel free to go and, do the washing up or something. So I've had Delirium Tremens 4 times that I know of, 4 times that I'm certain that I had them. And I'm certain because I either had a diagnosis that I had it, or in retrospect, I could see it for what it was. Delirium Tremens is sneaky, because while you have it, you don't know that you've got it. You don't know that you're delirious. You don't know that you are delusional. It hides itself from you very well. I've had Delirium Tremens 4 times, but there are other manifestations of acute alcohol withdrawal. One is alcoholic hallucinosis, which has a few kind of overlapping characteristics with Delirium Tremens in my experience. And the other one is alcoholic psychosis, which I've also had. And that is a very different thing, which I'll talk about another time. For now, the difference between alcoholic hallucinosis and Delirium Tremens is that alcoholic hallucinosis is characterized by auditory and visual hallucinations. but you are kind of aware. You have a sense that these things that you're seeing and hearing and experiencing are not real. So, for example, when I was experiencing hallucinosis, I was able to put my head under a pillow to block them out, just briefly. And I would say, or another example, I would be lying in bed after I'd been drinking extremely heavily for a long period of time, and I would be aware that I was my perception wasn't quite right, and I would close my eyes and I would see things moving. But I was still in my mind. I was still oriented for the actual time and space, right? So I would close my eyes and then I would be absolutely hurtling in first person perspective through this kind of cyberpunk city, and then the landscape would change and I'd be flying through mountains, and it was generating all of this, moving at like 500 miles per hour through incredibly detailed cityscapes and landscapes, to the point where, because I wasn't able to stop them when I closed my eyes, I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to sleep while this is happening. I may as well just try to enjoy the ride. That's hallucinosis, because in delirium tremens, that is absolutely not possible. You are out of control. You are not oriented to space and time, by which I mean you have no conception that the things that you're perceiving are not real. It doesn't occur to you that they're not real. So before I tell you what the experience is like, and before I start kind of collecting together a few of the experiences that I had, the obvious question that everybody wants to ask when I talk about this is, how much was I drinking and for how long? So I had delirium tremens 4 times that I know of. I think there may have been one before. I was on an aeroplane after 4 months of drinking a large-ish bottle of vodka every day for 4 months and eating very, very poorly, right? Very terrible nutrition, just a loaf of bread or some beef noodles or something. And it began on a flight out of Azerbaijan while I was being deported. And I was beginning to hallucinate on that flight that the plane was crashing and that everybody was screaming and praying to Allah. And it was utterly petrifying. There was no doubt in my mind that the plane was crashing and that everybody was praying and screaming. And I remember that the cabin crew at one point started giving me beer on the flight. And it occurred to me later, much later, that stopped the hallucination, right? But it occurred to me later that it was very likely that it was me screaming on that flight. And I think, because they didn't charge me for the beer that they were giving me, I think they were giving it to me to settle me down. And that is I think the first brush that I'm aware of, in hindsight, with delirium tremens, was hallucinating a plane crash. I know that I've mentioned that story on the channel before, but I don't think I went into any detail about what that was like, because as far as my body was concerned, as far as my memory of that event is concerned, and as far as my nervous system was concerned, I was in a plane crash. All of my sensory and perceptual data was convinced I was in a plane crash, that I was about to die. And you take that away with you afterwards. After the delirium tremens has faded, after you've sought treatment or after you've dried out, whatever, if you survive it, then your body really went through that experience as if it was real. There's no two ways about it. And as we go through this and I talk about some other experiences, when I'm telling you about it, you have to understand that just people who've been through delirium tremens know when somebody else has gone through it, because it is incredibly difficult to explain to somebody who hasn't gone through it that you feel like you really did experience the things that you were hallucinating. It is not like LSD, it is not like an acid trip or mushrooms or anything like that. It's not like ayahuasca. It's not like, maybe it's like PCP, I wouldn't know, I haven't tried PCP. Maybe it might be a bit more like that, because quite a lot of people come off PCP believing that they've had a religious experience. And that sometimes happens to people going through delirium tremens too. They attribute their experience to a meeting with God or some divine insight. Some of the early accounts of delirium tremens are explicitly religious. They seem to happen to people who had not much in their lives but religion, and therefore that is what they will project in their hallucinations, and therefore they think they had a religious experience afterwards. Perhaps they did. Perhaps it was a legitimate religious experience, and maybe it's me that's wrong. So the question was, to get back to it, how much had I been drinking and for how long to experience delirium tremens? Well, I was a liquor drinker, namely vodka, whiskey, and gin. A little bit of rum, but not really. It was vodka mainly, whiskey secondary, and gin if I wanted to just turn my brain off entirely. And the first time I experienced delirium tremens was after a period of 6 months, about 5 of which I had been drinking at least a 70 centiliter bottle of vodka, whiskey, or gin every day. And that was the minimum that I would drink. And often more. I got into the pattern of drinking 70 centiliters in a day, going out, buying more, drinking a quarter of that, waking up, drinking what was left, going out, getting more. So it kind of totaled up to, I don't know, call it a litre of hard liquor a day for about 5 months. At that time, I was 37 or 36, and in relatively good health, considering that I had already been an alcoholic for a long time by then. I was quite fit. I had just finished an 8-month solo cycling trip and was formerly very fit and that kind of thing. So as alcoholics go, I was in relatively good shape, and 5 months of hard drinking will turn that on its head very quickly. So by the end of that period, it's worth noting that delirium tremens doesn't just depend on alcohol intake, it also depends on sleep and nutrition. And if those are also of very poor quality, you are more likely to experience delirium tremens. And I would like to know, most of the people that I've spoken to who have experienced delirium tremens to the extent that I did were also hard liquor drinkers. And this is an overgeneralization. I preface this comment by acknowledging that it's an overgeneralization. It seems more likely that you will experience extremely severe withdrawal symptoms like DTs if you're drinking hard liquor at an extreme rate for a prolonged amount of time. But I would like to hear from the exceptions to that rule in the comments. So for example, if you are a wine drinker or a beer drinker or something, but you still have experienced delirium tremens, leave it in the comments how much you were drinking and for how long, and we'll see if we can find a baseline for this. But that's how much I was drinking, and my diet was pathetic. It was Haribo, it was like candy, sweets, and not much else. The occasional hot dog from a burger van, or packet ramen or tin soup, most of which was going to be thrown up anyway. I wasn't a huge vomiter, but in that stage of alcoholism, when you're really circling the drain as I was, when you're kind of facing the end stage of alcoholism, that is when death is creeping up on you, your nutrition will be bad, as mine was. And that first one that I had, I think was probably the worst, because I had no conception of delirium tremens. My impression of delirium tremens was from the movie Dumbo, when Dumbo drinks a barrel of alcohol, rum I think it is, I'm not sure, and then hallucinates pink elephants on parade, pink elephants on parade, that song. That was the only insight I had into delirium tremens. And that's what I assumed it was like, more like a drunken dream than a completely chaotic, delusional state of mind with vivid, realistic and convincing, persuasive, even manipulative hallucinations. So this channel, Bat Country, is actually named after that period of delirium tremens, because the very first thing that I remember hallucinating was a giant bat that I could hear scratching under my bed. And when I looked over, when I was finally brave enough to take a peek at what was causing this scratching under my bed, and this huge bat scurried out and crawled up the wall. And in my mind, as I went into detail previously about this particular event, I trapped it in a food container, and I took it and then wrapped the food container in a towel and put it in a plastic bag. And then I took it outside my house and I left it on the doorstep. And then a few days later, once I had recovered and come slightly back to my senses, I went back downstairs and I opened that food container and found it empty. And that was a harrowing experience. Seeing evidence that my perception was wrong. It's incredibly destabilizing. It's very confusing. And once you've had delirium tremens, you never ever fully trust your perception ever again. You never ever fully 100% trust the things that you see and experience and hear. So, the way that it usually starts, right, because delirium tremens doesn't start immediately. There's quite often a delay, and that delay is agonizingly long. It's about 72 hours between your last drink and the onset of delirium tremens. And in those 72 hours, even if you've been drinking as heavily as I had been towards the end of my alcoholism, which was like suicidal drinking, I'm not exaggerating, that was the intention of my drinking. It was what I was trying to do. You go through, you don't get hangovers anymore at that stage of drinking. It's not a hangover. The hangovers are a thing of the past for you if you're an alcoholic of that nature. You go into withdrawal pretty quick, and it is possible, I should add, that you can start to experience symptoms of withdrawal while you're still drinking. So if you're drinking a litre of vodka every day for 2 months, and then the following day you drink half a litre of vodka, and you continue drinking half a litre of vodka, you will may still experience withdrawal symptoms, even though you're still drinking enough to get the average person hammered. It's bizarre. So it's the way that your body kind of acclimatizes to the presence of alcohol and ethanol in your system, that you can experience withdrawal while you're still drinking. That's a lesser known fact. I say it as often as possible on the channel because I don't think people are aware of that. And I think it can trip people up. Anyway, those 72 hours are tricky because you're going to feel generally, after the last drink, you might black out and you're going to wake up and you're going to feel okay for a while because there's still alcohol in your system. But as it begins to subside and leak out through all of your pores, then you start to feel awful and anxious and sweaty and sticky and disgusting. You might have nausea and you will definitely have insomnia and your heart might be racing. And then you'll survive that for another full day of feeling like that. And then it might fade and you think to yourself, shit, I got away with it. I had a huge bender. I went on a massive binge, and in 2 days it was out of my system, and I can go back to being a normal functioning human being in society. And then you start to hear things, and that's the first stage. And you won't recognize straight away that it's an auditory hallucination. If you're anything like me, and like many of the people that I've spoken to, that noise, these kind of low-level, unidentifiable noises that you can hear, will drive you near to crazy, trying to find out where they're coming from. They will sound like they're coming from an air conditioner, or they will come from a light fitting, or they will come from your phone, even though your phone is off, or a laptop. And you'll snoop around trying to identify the source of what is quite often very low music, like unidentifiable music, or voices. The first time for me, it was music. And the reason I chose this kind of lo-fi 1940s kind of indistinct music that I play in the back of my videos is because that is what I heard. This music that I play, it's not just for ambience. It's because I find it a little bit unsettling, because it reminds me of turning my house upside down, trying to identify where this music was coming from. And really, it didn't exist. It was in my head. Worse is whispering. Okay, so there is a very slim chance that if you start to hear whispering, if you start to hear people calling your name, for example, or talking about you, but you can't see where it's coming from, go to the hospital, phone an ambulance straight away, because this is the last point at which you will be able to do it. It only gets worse after this, because this is the last time you will be lucid. Is when you start to hear whispering, as if two people are talking about you, but not to you. I had this prolonged delusion in the early stages of going through DTs at my parents' house once. I think this must have been the second time that I went through it, I'm not sure. Where they had bought me a puppy, right? And were trying to keep it a secret from me. That was the delusion. And in the evening, it started to creep on where I could hear and feel a puppy rubbing against my legs and making noise and that kind of thing. And I went to bed, had a terrible night's sleep of just vicious, violent, gory nightmares. But when I woke up and got up in the morning, that delusion was still real. And I was listening to my mum have a conversation on the phone to a dog breeder that she had bought this gift, this puppy. She bought the puppy for me and was on the phone asking for some advice about how I should best care for this puppy. And I was in my bedroom, the bedroom of their house that they had opened up for me, because I was in such a bad way at 37 that I had to go and move back in with my parents. Such was the depths of my alcoholism. I'd thrown it all away. And the conversation they were having was secretive. Like it feels like that everybody's trying to keep secrets from you all the time. Eventually, I came out of my bedroom to confront my mum about it. And I said to her, paraphrasing, I was like, look, I know what you've done. I know that you got me the puppy. You don't need to whisper about it. I already know, so you don't need to keep it a secret. And my mum, who knew that I was hallucinating, but didn't tell me I was hallucinating, said, I promise you I'm not whispering. I promise. And of course she was telling the truth. And now I remember that experience and I try to think of it from her perspective. She knew that I was delusional and hallucinating, and I had come out of my bedroom and I'd said to her, I know what you've done. You don't need to keep it a secret. How fucking frightening that must be for her. Right? I said a moment ago that once the whispering begins, that is the last bit of lucidity that you will have. And it's an emergency already at that point. And that's true. But my experience actually was that the early stages of the delirium was occasionally punctuated by little windows of lucidity, where I was able to kind of rationalize again, just a little bit. But that brings no comfort, because in those little windows of insight, those little windows of lucidity, they are absolutely defined by raw panic, and beyond panic, like an absolute certainty that I am about to die. Just completely certain that if you've had an anxiety attack in your life or a panic attack, then you might be familiar with the feeling of impending death, right? That death is close. That at any second you might drop down and die of a heart attack or something. Well, with delirium tremens, in these little pockets of lucidity that it gives you, that fear is profound. And it's very strange, because I have I'm not trying to make myself sound tough here, right? I've just had a weird life. But I've been faced with situations where I was actually certain that I was going to die, right? I won't bore you with the details. I've talked about them elsewhere. But I've been in situations where I knew that I was facing death, where I was sure that I was about to die. And that was less frightening than the delirium tremens fear of death. So a few times in my life, I have made peace with the fact that I am about to die. I've been through the process of bargaining. I've been through the process of reconciliation with myself. Like, okay, it's been a good life. If it ends right now, I'll be okay with that. I've done all of that stuff in real life. But the fear that you have in delirium tremens is way beyond your control. It cannot be reasoned with. It's almost like the fear is a component of the delirium tremens itself. Like it's like part of the package. The fear is not a response to the things that you're seeing and experiencing. The fear is part of it. A little bit like the fear that you experience in a nightmare, where it's irrational. It doesn't, the situation that you're dreaming about doesn't warrant the level of fear that you feel, but it is profound, right? That's what it's like. That's what delirium tremens fear is like. It's not a rational understanding that you are about to die. It is just pure fear. That's what it is. And it's a kind of fear that stays with you long after all of the hallucinations and all of the delusions have faded away. It is a kind of fear that leaves a big bruise on your psyche. Okay, so like I said, in my life, I've had the opportunity to make peace with the fact I was about to die. But it was the fake fear of delirium tremens that stayed with me the longest. It's an incredibly cruel and manipulative condition. There are patterns to what we see in delirium tremens too. One of the great things about Delirium Dirk was that he was the first person I'd ever heard talk about things that I also saw. Because I had this sense that I could never tell anyone what I'd seen. No one would understand. We all feel like that who've been through delirium tremens. We all feel like no one will possibly understand until we hear somebody else say it. And then we're like, oh my God, we have common ground. Oh my God, I'm not alone in this. So I saw disfigured, or this malformed lizards and like things that looked like real animals but weren't. So things like snakes. Snakes were a big part of my hallucinations. For other people, it's insects, and I had that a little bit. I had ants crawling out of my pores and stuff like that, and that's a horrible experience because it's not just that you see it. That alone would be terrifying enough, but because the hallucinations are so convincing, you feel it. You feel it crawl out of the pores of your skin, and you feel it 100,000 times all at once, because every single insect that you're hallucinating has its own kind of effect on your body. You feel it all individually, like your entire body is just a heaving mass of ants and stick insects and stuff. But mostly for me, it was snakes, and it was like disfigured animals, at least in the early stages of the hallucinations, because in the later stages, they start to become much more complex and much more sophisticated. But in those early stages, for me, it was insects a little bit, and then it was weird reptiles and lizards. That was bats, of which I had no pre-existing fear. I still, to this day, don't fear bats, but I did in that moment. I wonder if I should tell you another quick anecdote. Okay, so there's a difference between fearing an animal and being confronted with it, right? So I had even to this day, have no particular fear of snakes. But in Kyrgyzstan once, I was crossing a river naked, for reasons too boring to explain, when I encountered a snake in the river. A big lurid green thing, like so vibrantly green that it looks like it couldn't exist in nature. This is a real thing that happened. This is before the delirium tremens and stuff. It really happened. And it was right in front of my face. And despite having... At the time, I had my hands above my head because the water was very powerful and it was up to my chest. And I was holding my belongings above my head to keep them dry as I crossed this river. And this snake just came up right in front of my face and went down. And I was petrified in that moment. So, despite having no pre-existing fear of snakes or of animals in particular, when you're confronted with them in that kind of situation, it is terrifying, whether you have a fear of them or not. That again is a little bit like delirium tremens, where you will see disfigured things, or just even normal things, like ants aren't particularly scary. But if you see them in delirium tremens, they come with this layer of terror as well. Everything that you experience in delirium tremens comes with this additional kind of baked in layer of abject terror. If there was one particularly iconic thing that defined my delirium tremens, though, it was faces. Horribly contorted, injured and disfigured human faces. I would see them everywhere. And I haven't talked about this stuff for so long. And even now I can feel it making me uncomfortable. So I would see faces injured by shrapnel, like with the bottom jaw torn away or like half the face missing. Quite often maggots, like the faces would be rotten. The person looking at me, the face I would see would still be alive. And I remember one in particular, like I just saw faces all the time, to the point where I would know that I would call an ambulance the moment I was able to see a face. Right? Later in my delirium tremens experiences, that was when I knew that I was in trouble. And I remember one in particular, and I was going through alcoholic hallucinosis, and I knew I was hallucinating. And I was hiding under my bed covers, and suddenly it must have been the moment that I tripped over from hallucinosis into delirium tremens. I remember this kind of threshold because suddenly I was hiding under the covers in the dark, just terrified, and suddenly all of under the duvet was just smoke, like the bed was on fire. And I had to quickly get out, and I moved the duvet down, and along the huge long window along my bedroom was just a row of disfigured faces staring in from the window to me, like at me, staring at me, kind of accusing, like pleadingly. Like I had the sense that they needed help, as if some catastrophe had happened and I was in the only safe room in the world, and all of these injured and dying people were outside the window staring in at me, kind of begging to be allowed to come in. And I wouldn't let them because I was terrified of them. And the weirdest part about that particular hallucination is that not only were those faces not real, that window didn't exist. I know what my bedroom looked like. That was a bare wall. But in the Delirium Tremens, it was a big, long bay window with all of these kind of melting, disfigured faces staring in at me, bits falling off, hair like sloughing off the head, and just grotesque, just a terrifying image. And that's really the easy stuff to deal with, because that's really just seeing things. That is seeing things and being terrified, because they're just visualizations. As horrific and like almost life-alteringly traumatic as it is to see that kind of thing, it's still only the beginning. You're still only in the first 12 hours or so of delirium tremens at this point, because after this, if it continues to go untreated as it did for me a couple of times, the hallucinations and the delusions become impossible to communicate. They suddenly become incredibly complex and deeply sophisticated, and they have an internal kind of logical structure. I would have delusions that, at least in my mind, lasted days. And the characters in them, because there are often characters, like people in these hallucinations that just simply don't exist. You've invented them. Very rarely, I believe, will you see a person that is in your life, right? It happens a little bit. You might see like an old school teacher, which I did. Or you might see a loved one that you lost years ago, just sitting in a chair. But in general, the people that you're interacting with are just completely generated, and they will recur throughout the delusion and the hallucination. Their personality is stable, in a sense. And I had like hallucinated characters who had their own development, their own kind of character arcs, for lack of a better word, where they would dip out of the hallucination and then return later, having had an adventure all of their own, beyond my perception. They would return. It's so hard to explain. And sometimes these kind of hallucinatory characters will demand things of you. They will be manipulating you. That's what they're doing, right? So I remember I remember a lot, right? So I was in the street in a village called Polperro in Cornwall, which is where I was living at the time. And I'm pretty sure I was really in the street. And that town, that village, was full of tourists in the summer. And I remember, oh God, it's so horrible to recollect. Because I've got no way to know. It's horrible to recollect because this might have been really happening in the street. I might have been really behaving like this. But I remember standing in the street, and the street was lined with people, all of them with blank faces. And I mean blank as in no features on their face. And they were all moving away from me. And every time I took a step, it was almost like they were on a conveyor belt. And every time I moved, they all would turn to look at me. And then I would have to stand still. And then they would look away and they would carry on down this, like moving around. And then I would take another step. And then they would suddenly freeze and all turn towards me. And I have this horrible hunch that I really was creeping down the high street of Pulpero in tourist season, like one terrified step at a time, feeling so paranoid. You know, this is a weird reference, but there's a game called Superhot where time only moves if you are moving. So anytime you're standing still, everything is standing still, and then you go to move and everything moves, right? That's what that was like. It was a deeply paranoid feeling, really a powerfully paranoid delusion that every time I moved, everybody with these like haunting, empty faces would turn to look at me, like I was the center of everybody's attention every time I moved. I honestly think, with some visual differences, I have a feeling that has given me a little bit of insight into what it's like to have a schizophrenic delusion. And that feeling is compounded by the fact that when I was going through Delirium Tremens in Berlin, there was a schizophrenic guy on my street. And I used to read his Facebook posts. He was taking no medication, and he was a deeply disturbed individual. In fact, we weren't there at the same time, but he ended up on the same psych ward that I went to several times, Bodelschwing in Berlin. He also talked about it on Facebook. And from the paranoid stuff that he was putting on Facebook, I'm pretty convinced that my experience of Delirium Tremens gave me a little kernel of what it's like to be so completely detached from reality and so deeply paranoid. I think I know what it might be like. And naturally, as the complexity of these delusions kind of piles on, they're influenced by, first of all, by real things that you've encountered in your life, right? So bizarre bits of knowledge that you'd completely forgotten about will suddenly reappear in your memory. And I remember I was going through Delirium Tremens in my parents' house, right? I didn't know I was going through it. And somebody came to the door of my parents' house when I was alone, and I opened it. And it was a guy who was talking to me, but he was saying the Lord's Prayer in Old English. And I understood it completely. Ferde Urla, though the art in Jofnum, Bidana Nama Gehalgot, so on and so forth. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that was in my memory because I had read it 25 years earlier for A-levels. I had read the Lord's Prayer in Old English, and somehow it would just pick that up, put it in my brain at the back somewhere. I'd forgotten all about it until this random guy on the doorstep started saying it to me. And I don't know to this day whether that guy was real or not. But that's what it will do. It will pull things that you'd forgotten about and use them to influence your hallucinations. Or, worse and scarier, it will take live stimuli from around you and manipulate it into your hallucination. The example that I've given in the past of this was, again, at my parents' house. Because when I was going through this at my parents' house, I wasn't getting treatment for it. So the whole Delirium Tremens experience played out from start to finish without treatment. And that happened at least twice. And at one point, I know I've told this story before, so I'll just summarize it really quickly. I'd been to prison in Kazakhstan, right? And back then, that experience had been deeply traumatic. In the process of going to prison there, that's why I have this titanium tooth, is because the police broke my jaw in the process of arresting me. And it was a horrible experience. In fact, I went through alcohol withdrawal in the prison cell, in the jail cell, in the middle of the Central Asian steppe. And that experience was awful. And if you have a fear of something like prison, or of police, or of large gangs of people, they will be in your hallucination, there to persecute you. One of my hallucinations I had imagined that I was back in prison in Kazakhstan, except it was subverted slightly because it was like this old Soviet prison. It didn't really look like the prison I was actually in. It looked like a kind of like movie version of it, with like toothless Soviet soldiers guarding the place. And I was trying to escape the prison, and in the hallucination I had escaped, and then was hit as I was escaping. I was climbing a prison wall, and I was hit with a searchlight, and I turned around and there was this old Russian colonel there, and he said my name, and then I looked really close, and it was my dad in a full Soviet kind of colonel's uniform, that kind of olive green with too many medals and all of that stuff. And then I recognized it was my dad, and the hallucination changed slightly so that he had been smuggled in, pretending to be a Russian colonel or a Russian general. He'd been smuggled in by the British embassy as a kind of like secret agent in order to extract me from the prison and get me to safety. So all of that was the hallucination. In the real world, what had actually happened was I had climbed out of my bedroom window and was trying to climb over my parents' garden wall. And my dad had come out in a dressing gown, shined a torch on me, which was the searchlight, and then brought me back inside. That was what happened in the real world. But all of that stuff that was happening was my brain was just taking bits of actual perception and using it to build out the hallucination. And it was so convincing. In fact, I remember trying to squeeze, when I was escaping from the prison in my mind, I was squeezing down this kind of chute, this kind of like air conditioning duct thing, with metal walls on either side, and it was so tight that I couldn't breathe. And when I looked back on where I'd been trying to escape in real life, I fully believe that I was actually stuck between my parents' house, the wall of their house, the outside wall, and their garden wall, which is a gap about this. And I am not a small guy. I believe there is a real risk that I could have jammed myself in there and asphyxiated to death. That's not what happened that night, but that we do lose people in delirium tremens to stuff like that. We run around the streets and we get into trouble, and we can't explain ourselves to the police because in our minds the police are the enemy. And one of the most manipulative things that delirium tremens will do is that it will hide itself from your consciousness. It will rationalize its own existence, which makes it incredibly hard to break out of it. And sometimes it's no good to tell someone in delirium tremens that they're hallucinating. You can, if it's just hallucinosis, that will help. Do tell them. But if you're in delirium tremens, you will suspect that that person has an agenda for telling you that you're hallucinating. In the same way, I imagine that paranoid schizophrenics don't believe you when you say you're a paranoid schizophrenic to them. They think that maybe you are the paranoid schizophrenic. Okay, we'll wrap up there, I think. I just wanted to talk about this again. I haven't talked about it for like a year and a half. And it's such an interesting thing that this is my way of kind of warming back up to the topic so that I can kind of do it justice. It's been so long now since those experiences that I'm able to reflect on them without quite so much emotional volatility. I can kind of see it a little bit more rationally. But I will say this before I end this video. These experiences stay with you long after they're over. So if you experience, for example, in one of the delirious hallucinations that you experience, if you experience the death of a loved one, if you witness the death of a loved one, your entire body and your entire psychology experiences that as though it did happen, right? If, for example, if like me, which I'll talk about perhaps in a later video, you're subjected to extreme torture, then as far as your body and your mind is concerned, it happened for real. You really did experience it, because the hallucination is so convincing and so persuasive, and you are experiencing the pain for real, and you are seeing your body being torn apart for real, that it may as well be real. And that will fuck you up for a long time after the experiences are over. Delirium tremens is not a thing that just happens for a week and then you move on. It happens for a week and then you spend months picking up the pieces and dealing with the wreckage and questioning what's real and what isn't. And many people will experience PTSD even though the things that they experienced were not technically real. That's an absolutely real phenomenon. If you've been through this, if you've seen the kinds of things that you see in Delirium Tremens, the gore, the violence, the sex, the inhumanity, the terror, the bizarre religious visualizations, all of that stuff, it doesn't just stop once the hallucinations fade. It doesn't just stop once someone sticks a benzodiazepine in your mouth. The fallout from delirium tremens needs to be treated the same way that it would need to be treated if those experiences had been real. That's all I've got to say for today. Thank you very much for watching, especially if you've seen me talk about this kind of content, this kind of topic in the past. If you stayed with me, even though you kind of have a feeling that I've talked about it a bit before, thank you for staying with me. Please do, if you'd like a kind of back channel to Bat Country, to me and to the Bat Country community, head over to patreon.com/batcountrysober and sign up there for behind the scenesy stuff. Also, go and visit betterwithoutbooze.me. That's the world's leading sobriety platform. And with all of that shilling done, which even feels incongruous even to me after talking about that topic for as long as I did, thank you very much for watching, and as always, good luck out there.